Hey everyone, this is Pastor Jeff Kennedy, and I want to welcome you back to the Revelation course. And we're going to be looking at Revelation chapter 4. We're going to be looking primarily at John's call account today. It's very controversial, but we want to be reminded of the 4 or 5. Actually, I gave you 6, if you recall, interpretive or hermeneutical approaches to the book of Revelation. And depending on which hermeneutical approach you take, that will really determine the outcome of how you interpret these chapters, particularly chapters 4 through 8, with respect to these plagues that are being poured out on the world. And so if you recall, we dealt with the historicist, preterist, futurist, and then also the idealist views. I gave you 2 extra ones that are not in your textbook. I gave you the eclectic view, which is the view of Greg Beale, the modified eclectic view. I also gave you what I'm referring to as the typological view, or a typologist view, in which case we see a lot of these ideas, these tropes, these symbols that you see in the Old Testament. They are being fulfilled in the New Testament, or John is seeing a fulfillment of them, but they're being fulfilled not as necessarily a direct trajectory from the Old to the New, as they are a repeating pattern and then escalating and terminating. And so I gave you that view as well. We're going to look at Revelation 4, 1 through 3. Here we go in the CSB. It says, "After this I looked, and there in heaven was an open door. The first voice that I heard, speaking to me like a trumpet, said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this.' Immediately I was in the Spirit. And there was a throne in heaven, and someone was seated on it. And the one seated there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian stone, a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald." We're primarily going to be going back and looking at how these symbols and how this imagery was used in the Second Temple Jewish period and Second Temple literature. And we're going to be looking at how it was used in the Old Testament as well. That will be critical to our understanding of the book going forward. But right now, we do want to delineate these particular 4 views. So the historicist view, if you recall, in the subsequent breaking of the 7 seals, chapters 6 through 8, the events that this action calls forth, the vision gives a glimpse of the conquest of imperial Rome for 300 years, culminating in Constantine's establishment of Christianity as the religion of the empire. Now, what would be the problem with that particular very specific historical view? Well, we said that the problem with this view, of course, is that it's usually guilty of the fallacy of overspecification, though it certainly does have some very interesting elements to it, but it's usually guilty of what I refer to as the fallacy of overspecification, and it can only be understood in retrospect. Now, to its credit, I think some of what you see in the book of Revelation can only be understood in retrospect. There are some things that you and I will only understand when they have unfolded and when they have taken place. We will look back on them and say, that's how that was supposed to happen. To the credit of the historicist view, I would say that's not a bad thing, but typically trying to really pin down the vision to a particular historical period can be very problematic. And it's problematic, if you recall, because for every person who holds a historicist view, they can have a different scheme. And they usually do. There are usually so many schemes we can't even articulate them all here. So they have a very particular view of this as it unfolds in history. The preterist, if you recall, also holds to a historical view, but they hold to a past-fulfilled historical view. So for them, John's experience is reminiscent of Ezekiel's call account, in which he receives a theophany. For the preterists, however, the former devotes the first half of the book to prophecies related to the judgment of Jerusalem, which is also the subject of John's apocalypse. Ezekiel's visions concerned the first destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC by the Babylonians, whereas John foresees the second destruction in AD 70 administered by the Romans. So they have a very particular view of Ezekiel's prophecies being the destruction of really the first temple, and then John's prophecy is really looking at that repeated pattern. That actually is typology, by the way, but that repeated pattern being fulfilled in AD 70, administered by the Romans. It's also part of their view that both prophets, Ezekiel and John, see these disasters as having God as their author, who sits on the throne of sovereignty and of judgment. And so in this chapter, we are introduced most probably, on their view, to a heavenly courtroom scene. The judge sits on the throne, verse 2, where, as we shall see in chapter 5, he is about to hand down a sentence upon the accused, which are the inhabitants of the earth who persecute his saints. The plaintiffs are the martyrs of Christ, whose complaint against their persecutors is recorded later in the vision, chapter 6, verse 9. And the accused, that is Jerusalem, is about to be condemned. The repetition of the expression after this, which is the Greek phrase metatauta, literally does mean after these things for them. So at the end of verse 1, it identifies the present material as the previously announced things, that is, the things that are about to happen after these things, metatauta. Chapter 1, verse 19 is literally rendered. This is what happens next. So since John was told in the first century that these things are about to take place and they're going to happen immediately and they're going to happen soon, they take this phrase to be quite literal, meaning that it was going to happen before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And so the seven-sealed book in chapter 5, 1 and following is God's sentence against Jerusalem as the Babylon. If you recall, in the first few weeks we established that their view was that the great whore, the great prostitute Babylon in Revelation chapter 18 is Jerusalem, right? Where Christ was killed. And the subsequent breaking of the first 6 seals depicts the Jewish crisis of AD 66 through 70, the war between the Jews and Rome, issuing in the utter destruction of the Jewish capital state and the religious system. Now this, if you recall, this interpretation only works if this book was written before AD 70, right? If it was written before AD 70. And now we come to the futurist view, which for them, everything in the previous chapters concerns the things which you have seen, and, quote, the things which are, which is chapter 119. Now this chapter is a turning point marking the things that must take place in the future. So for dispensationalist futurists, after this, or more literally, after these things, so metatauta, that phrase in Greek, means after the things of the church. That is to say, after the church age. That's how they interpret that. So they blow that phrase out to the entire church age. So these are the things that are going to happen when the church age is closed at the rapture of the church. Thus the material in Revelation after this point for them will be fulfilled after the church is gone. Some in this camp believe that John's transportation to heaven may be viewed as a type of the rapture of the church. And the mention of a voice like a trumpet in verse 1, chapter 4, verse 1, here may recall the language of the rapture passages. Sure enough, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 51 through 54, refers to the last trumpet being blown before the resurrection, at the resurrection. And 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 through 18 refers to the voice of the archangel and the trumpet call of God. So dispensational futurists note that the church is not seen here on earth, but is only seen in heaven. So from chapter 9 through 17, right, and then forward into really up to about chapter 18 at the end of the Great Tribulation, or chapter 13, depending on where you end the Great Tribulation in this book, they would say the word church doesn't appear again. In fact, it doesn't appear until chapter 22, verse 16 or something like that, right? Now, I have to say there are some real difficulties with this view. In other words, the view that because the word church is missing in between chapters 7 and chapters 18 or 22, that the church is somehow missing, has gone missing in a rapture, an implied rapture is what they're saying. So in the first place, it is not a typology. It's not a typology. Those who assert that John's call account is a type of the future rapture of the church are not typologizing the text, they're allegorizing the text, and typology and allegorization are not the same thing. How are they different? Well, in typological exegesis, typology is never dehistoricized. What do we mean by this? Well, in allegorizing the text, we simply go back to the original temple or the tabernacle or the parable or whatever it is we're allegorizing, and we're spiritualizing the meaning and decontextualizing it. We're dehistoricizing it, right? But typology doesn't do that. Typology fully recognizes the historical importance of the original archetype and then sees the new type as the fulfillment of that shadow And so it does not dehistoricize the original account. But in order to get John's call account to be a future rapture of a church, you have to allegorize the text. You just do. So secondly, while it is true that the word church, that is the Greek word ekklesia, does not appear between chapters 6 through 13, ostensibly in what is referred to as the Great Tribulation, that's not the whole story. First of all, you have a semantic problem there. The word ekklesia also doesn't appear to describe believers in heaven, chapter 19, verse 8, so apparently the church is not in heaven. It also does not describe believers during the Great Millennium, so apparently no one from the church is in the Great Millennium in chapter 20. It also does not it does not describe believers in the new creation or the new Jerusalem. It doesn't describe believers coming down out of heaven with Jesus. They're called the saints in Revelation chapter 19. Moreover, the word ecclesia doesn't appear in other eschatological or end times texts where Jesus returns for the saints or with the saints, right? So let me give you some examples here. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18 doesn't use the word church. 1 Corinthians 15:51 through 57, again, ecclesia is missing. Titus 2:11 through 14. Not there either. Additionally, the people of God in Revelation are described with other familiar New Testament names such as the bride, the faithful, his people, those whose names are written in the book of life, a kingdom, priests, and the saints. As a matter of fact, the name saints, or the word saints, is Paul's favorite description of the New Testament church when he is not calling them believers or church. So in other words, when Paul himself is writing to a church like Corinth, to the church in Corinth, to the saints in Corinth, the church, right? He refers to them as the saints. So it's his favorite term to refer to believers as the saints. The name saints in particular describes both earthly and heavenly dwelling believers. That is in Revelation 5:8, chapter 8, chapter 11, chapter 13, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19. So this word hagioi, or saints, describes both earthly believers and heavenly believers. So if the church is in heaven, why are they still referred to as saints? If they're coming down out of heaven in the second coming with Jesus in Revelation 19, why are they called the saints who are dressed in fine linen, right? Why are they referred to that way in Revelation chapter 19? Why are they called the returning church, right? So this word is across the board applied to Christians in the New Testament age, and it would be incumbent upon the writer to spell out to the church, the saints and the churches that he just wrote to, that these are not church saints, right? These are tribulation saints. So I think that poses a problem for this view. It's probably not insurmountable, but again, it's a semantic challenge. Another challenge is the change in symbolism. There's also a heightened symbolism after chapter 3, the letter portion of the book. Jesus is no longer called, for example, Jesus. How is he referred to? He's referred to as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. John says, I heard, right? A loud voice. I heard a message about the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and then I turned and saw a slain lamb. So Jesus referred to as a lion, as a lamb, not as Jesus. And then you also have the problem with the Antichrist. Where's the Antichrist in the book of Revelation by that name? Well, he doesn't appear by that name. The Antichrist, the forces of the Antichrist appear by other names, like the beast out of the sea or the beast out of the earth or the false prophet and that sort of thing. So you have this heightened symbolism between chapters 4 through 18, in which things are just called by other names. The church is referred to as the saints. Jesus is referred to as the lion and the lamb, or a warrior on a horse. The Antichrist is referred to as the beasts, or the false prophet, or a dragon, and that sort of thing. And then lastly, you have both the valediction and the salutation. So essentially what you have here is this book is explicitly addressed to local churches and ends with Jesus reminding John that he's given them this vision for the churches. Why would the churches need anything after Revelation chapter 3 if they're just gone? Why would they need any of it? If this book, according to chapter 22, verse 16, was given for the churches, that seems to be problematic. I'm not saying, again, it's insurmountable to the view that the church goes missing, but these things seem to be very problematic. So historical futurists, on the other hand, as opposed to dispensational futurists, would say that those futurists who reject the dispensational view do not place the rapture of the church here, but they agree with the dispensationalists that the future tribulation is the subject matter of the following chapters, 4 through 18, roughly. Essentially, you are dealing with a present age of tribulation. Jesus clearly said that in the world we will have tribulation, right? But the age of tribulation, the present age of tribulation, which is the church age, is going to escalate and terminate with a final 7-year period of tribulation. So these historical futurists would want to say, no, we don't quite buy into the dispensational scheme, but we do think some of this, a good portion of this, is off in the future. So those are the futurist ideas and some of the reasons that are very problematic to this idea. And now we come to the idealist view. To those who divide the book into 7 segments, this view is the beginning of section 2, or what they would refer to as Act 2 of the book. The opening words after these things does not mean this is what will happen next, but rather, this is the vision I saw next. In other words, this is the next thing I saw. So the entire church age is, from their perspective, depicted from an early standpoint in chapters 1 through 3, will now be viewed again, this time from a heavenly perspective. So what you're going to have are these alternating perspectives between an earthly perspective and a heavenly perspective. And the idealist camp would just say, look, you're just looking at the same thing here from the perspective, from highly charged symbolism and from a heavenly perspective. And the main point of the vision, according to them, for John, was to remind him and the church that God is still sovereignly orchestrating history from his throne, which is a repeated theme in this text. So those are the 4 views, beginning with chapter 4 and John's call account. Now we come to the 24 elders, the vision of the 24 elders, and the following vision will be a vision of some very strange creatures. And so it says, around the throne were 24 thrones, and on the throne sat 24 elders dressed in white clothes with golden crowns on their heads. Flashes of lightning and rumbles and peals of thunder came from the throne. 7 fiery torches were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God, or represent the 7 spirits of God. And then something like a sea of glass similar to crystal was also before the throne. So what I want to point out is that every one of these interpretive camps, and so you have the historicist, preterist, futurist, and idealist camps, right? They all define or attempt to define these symbols differently. So depending on which interpreter you're looking at, they're going to be pointing to different reference for the symbols themselves. So for example, the historicist Adam Clarke would identify the elders as the 23 Sanhedrin elders. Albert Barnes, for example, identifies them as the redeemed saints. So he actually believes that the elders represent or symbolically represent the saints before God, maybe the patriarchs and then the 12 apostles as leaders. Preterists see it as a symbolic heavenly court. That's J. Adams. And so you have all these symbols. The 24 elders are angelic hosts. That's George Ladd and Robert Mounce. Mounce describes them as an exalted and angelic order who serve and adore God as the heavenly counterpart to the 24 priestly and 24 Levitical orders. And so they clearly take that as symbolic. But Gabeling, Frank Gabeling, Ryrie, Walvard, Tom Ice see the elders are New Testament saints that have been raptured, and now they're before the throne and they're worshiping. And so that's a heavenly picture of raptured saints. Of all of the views on who the 24 elders are and what these thrones are all about, what we're going to see here in the next few verses, next couple paragraphs, is we're going to see lots of different weird creatures, like all of these strange creatures that surround the throne. In fact, it's a multitude. And I think what we're looking at here, based on how these images and these symbols are used in Second Temple literature, Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic and prophetic literature, and also the Old Testament, I think what we're looking at here is concentric circles of functionaries that surround the throne of God. Let me give you an analogy of this. Let's say you wanted to go and see the President of the United States today. Let's say you were in Washington, D.C. I was there a few months ago. And let's say you just thought, no, I'm going to go to Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm going to roll up, just knock on his door and ask if I can meet him. What would you encounter? Well, here's what you would encounter. You would encounter layers and layers of functionaries. What do we mean by this? Well, the first person you would encounter would be the security guard at the gate, and it's very unlikely that you would even get past the security guard. But if you managed to climb the fence, as some have done, and you got past that security guard, you would be immediately accosted by many more security guards descending upon you. And then if you were somehow to get past them, once you got inside, you would find layers and layers of people before you could ever get to the president. And I think that's the kind of picture you're looking at here in Revelation chapter 4. You're looking at God as the center of the throne, Christ, who is at the center of the throne, Christ who is God. And he has concentric circles of these people. And you don't just roll up on his doorstep, chewing your gum and your blue jeans, saying, hey, I'd like to get a meeting with you, right? So the purpose of him seeing these functionaries or seeing these layers of beings surrounded the throne is not only to show us just how completely and thoroughly God is worshipped in the heavenlies, it's also to give us a sense of the importance of God. It's to give us a sense of the importance of the being that is being worshipped, the one who is at the center of all this worshiping activity. And now, what do we learn as New Testament Christians? We learn that we are the co-heirs of Christ. We learn that we may come boldly and confidently, though we always come humbly, but we come boldly before the throne of God, presenting our request before God. So we pass right through all of these layers of authoritative functionaries. We go straight to the throne room of God as his children. And so the imagery here is telling us something about the nature of God and his greatness and his grandeur, but it's also telling us something about the importance of being a saint, being a believer, being a churchman, and our access to the throne. Let's look at verses 6 through 11. I want to show you just how weird this scene begins to get. It becomes very strange. Chapter 4, verse 6 says something like a sea of glass similar to crystal was also before the throne. 4 living creatures covered with eyes in front and in back were around the throne on each side. The first living creature was like a lion. The second living creature was like an ox. And the third living creature had the face like a man. The fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. Each of the 4 living creatures had 6 wings. They were covered with eyes around and inside. Day and night they never stopped, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God, the Almighty, who was and who was to come. Whenever the living creatures give glory, honor, and thanks to the one seated on the throne, the one who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before the one seated on the throne and worship. The one who lives forever and ever, they cast their crowns before the throne and say, Our Lord and our God, you are worthy to receive glory and honor and power because you have created all things. And by your will they exist and were created. So much theology is just compressed down into this paragraph, verses 6 through 11. And so what I want to point out here is that really this imagery has been taken out of Ezekiel chapter 1, the cherubim, for example, who are the central worshipers, followed by all creation in the worship of God alone. And they represent the whole of animate life. All animate life performing its function to glorify God. And so this picture represents all creation in the worship of God. Now, what is John trying to tell us about Jesus? Remember, this book is in large part a revelation of Jesus. What is he trying to tell us about Jesus, the Son of God? Well, he's trying to tell us clearly that Jesus is the object of worship. Christ is the Lamb at the center of the throne is the only being who doesn't fall down and worship God. Why? Because he is God. That's the picture that is being displayed to us here. He is the God through whom God the Father created all things. Remember, all things were created for God, and they're unto God the Father, and they were created through Christ, and nothing has come into being, nothing has been made without him. So here we have this very important picture, all of these symbols representing now the whole of creation falling in worship of Christ, the Lamb who's at the center of the throne. Very important. He says in chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, we're getting to the sealed scroll now. He says, "Then I saw the right hand of the one seated on the throne, a scroll with writing on both sides, sealed with 7 seals. I also saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?' But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or even to look in it. I wept because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or even to look in it. And then one of the elders said to me, 'Do not weep. Look, the Lion from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered so that he is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals.'" Now, the scroll may be symbolic of the book of life. The book of life is referred to many times, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, but here in chapter 3, verse 5, chapter 13, chapter 20, chapter 21, we see this idea of a record or a ledger written on a scroll of all of those who have been sealed for eternal life, and it contains the names of all of those who are saved. And the reason that it's written inside and outside, that is to say there's writing on the inside and there's writing on the outside, the back of it, is that there are too many names to be contained on the inside alone. So the breaking of the seals requires someone who is worthy. And so there's this great distress, this great anxiety that John experiences because there just is no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth. Remember, we saw that under the earth really is a phrase that refers to hell or Tartarus or Hades, something like that, the pit, the abyss. That'll come up again in succeeding chapters. We see that the only person that is worthy in the next passage is the Lamb. And so we move on, chapter 5, verses 7 through 10. It says, when he took the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp and golden bowls filled with incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slaughtered. And you purchased people for God by your blood from every tribe and language and people and nation, and you made them a kingdom and priests to God, and they will reign on earth." And so here we see only the Lamb is worthy to open the scroll. And so we also see that the believers are referred to as a kingdom of priests. So God's entire church, made of Jew and Gentile, is referred to as a kingdom of priests, a kingdom of those who minister before the Lord. Now, the Lamb who is worthy is another apocalyptic image of Daniel chapter 7, 9 through 14, where the Son of Man receives all authority, dominion, and power over the nations, and also their worship. So here we see quite clearly that the Lamb is that person. Once again, the Lamb is the Son of Man, who ascends to the Ancient of Days and receives all of this. The incense represents the prayers of the saints, as is identified in the text. This incense was a historical symbol of temple and tabernacle prayer. Here we see the incense rising and God hearing the prayers. The new song in chapter 5, verse 9 is the new creation promised in Ezekiel. The saints as a royal priesthood are Christians in this present age who spiritually reign as co-heirs of Christ, and the worship that is given by all creation is given equally to the enthroned one and the Lamb. And so the picture, generally speaking, is of the worthiness of the Lamb to begin the ceremony of slicing the seals of this scroll to open it and to begin to read its messages. The first seal, in chapter 6, verses 1 through 2, he says, "Then I saw the Lamb open one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, 'Come!' And I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider held a bow. A crown was given to him, and he went out as a conqueror in order to conquer." And so here we see this beginning of a picture of 4 horsemen. And so what we're going to find here is that later in successive visions, the horsemen, even though they're identified, even though they're given their vocation in the opening of the seals, which is really the announcement of their vocation, it does seem that in succeeding chapters 6, 7, and 8, that they're told to hold off. They're told to hold off on their judgments and to wait. They're constrained, and then they're unleashed. Then they're released. So there is some debate here as to who the rider on the white horse is. Now, some historical futurists will see this as Christ himself. Some historicists, those in the historicist camp, will see this as the emperors of Rome, that sort of thing. And Preterius obviously would see this as Titus and Vespasian riding down to destroy Jerusalem. For the idealist, the white horse, though, becomes symbolic of the gospel itself, the gospel going out into the world. I think that view is quite problematic, actually, given the rest of the context of the horsemen and the winds. The four horsemen and the four winds seem to be, based on Ezekiel chapter 6, the same thing. Don't know, but it seems like in context it is. So for them, the four horsemen represents the universal sequence of conquest, war, famine, death, which is repeated time and time again in human history. No one can doubt that. No one would doubt that. It seems like there are lots of repeating patterns in history. Conquest, war, famine, death. Those things typically do follow each other, so no problem there. It's just that this really does look like an eschatological judgment in which by the time we get to the end of it with the trumpets and the bowls, the plagues, the trumpets themselves are referred to as plagues. By the time we get to the end of it, it's going to be quite clear that God is done. The time of the Gentiles is up, and God is pouring out his wrath on the world. And so chapter 6, verses 3 through 4 go on to say, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come. Then another horse went out, a fiery red one, and its rider was allowed to take peace from the earth so that people would slaughter one another, and a large sword was given to him. Again, lots of ways that people try to identify who the horseman is, but the red color for horseman does suggest war and bloodshed, and I think, generally speaking, all four of the views that we mentioned agree with that. So we have the second seal, which is open, and that looks like open war between humanity. We have the third seal, which looks like famine. We have the fourth seal, which looks like death, and the fifth seal, which looks like the martyrs, Christians, in this period who are killed and suffer for their faith. And so each one of these horsemen reveal a new aspect of judgment, right? But then it gets worse. Verses 9 through 11, particularly for Christians, particularly for those who name Christ as Savior and Lord. It says, then I saw him open the sixth seal. A violent earthquake occurred. The sun turned back like sackcloth made of hair. The entire moon became like blood. The stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree drops its unripe figs when shaken by a high wind. The sky was split apart like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved from its place. So let's stop right there and identify some of the symbolism in here. Typically, when you have symbols that refer to the heavenly bodies being shaken, or the sky or the sun turning black like sackcloth, Jesus uses this imagery in Matthew chapter 24. The prophets use this imagery in the Old Testament. These are usually symbolic depictions of the day of the Lord, the day in which the Lord saves his people and concurrently, at the same time, judges the Gentile nations and all apostate Israelites, right? So this is another symbolic picture of the day of the Lord coming, and the idea of the sky being split apart like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved from its place. What you're dealing with here is you're dealing with the prophetic symbolism of cosmic upheaval. So the prophetic symbolism of cosmic upheaval is portentous, and what it portends is that in the same way creation began and was blessed and pronounced good and very good, now you're starting to experience decreation. In order for new creation to come, decreation has to happen first. And so you have these symbols of cosmic upheaval where you have this sort of this world, this cosmos that is just shaking at the foundations under judgment as God pours his wrath out. Verse 15, then the kings of the earth, the nobles, the generals, the rich, the powerful, and even every slave and free person hid in the caves among the rocks of the mountains. So here, that symbol is just trying to say that every person from every walk of life tried to take refuge from this judgment, and they tried to hide in the caves and the rocks of the mountains. And look at what they said. They said to the mountains and to the rocks, they begged the mountains and the rocks and the caves, fall on us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, because the great day of their wrath has come. Who is able to stand? Now that's the question on the table. The question on the table is who can stand? Who can withstand this? What we're going to find in the succeeding paragraphs and chapters is that the people who can stand are the sealed, those who have been elect, those who have been set apart by Christ. That's who we're going to find can withstand this judgment that is being poured out on the world. They're the only people who can withstand it. So the seals do depict the end of this age and the second coming of Christ. They do. And the language is that of metaphor, describing in grandiose terms the dissolution of the cosmos in this present age. And so you can find symbols like this in all kinds of passages in the Old Testament, like Psalm 68, 7 through 8, Isaiah 13, 10 through 13, 24, 1 through 6, Isaiah 34, Jeremiah 4, Ezekiel 32, Joel 2, and chapter 3, Amos chapter 8, and Habakkuk chapter 3. And so what you're going to find is that the idea that God is going to bring forth new creation, and it's going to come, first of all, at the dissolution of the nations and the world. God is going to replace the good world with a better world. It's called new creation. And so the first 5 seals are the events that reoccur throughout history, but the 6th seal marks a change, the culmination of events leading up to divine judgment. Unbelievers know that they are under the wrath of God, and this is the thing that really strikes me about this particular vision, is that unbelievers try to take refuge from it, but they know that it's God's wrath that is being poured out on them. But instead of relenting and instead of repenting, what they do is they just cry out for death. And we'll find out later when the trumpets begin to be rolled out, they can't die. They're not able to die. So in that particular vision, people cry out for death. It's not given them, and they just suffer under the wrath of God, but they refuse to relent or to repent. So the passage teaches the broader lesson that people will seek refuge in anything other than the one true God. People will seek refuge in anything other than the one true God.